identity. And it was a great amount of bloodshed, blood, sweat, and tears that brought about the Emancipation Proclamation. It's almost hard to imagine the sacrifice that went into what ultimately culminated in the freeing of the slaves. The Civil War was the most bloody war ever known to this nation. We lost more people, more blood was shed in that war than any of the wars since then. It's almost unimaginable, but this was what was put on the table. The fight over the very soul of this nation. What was going to be done with the Africans who were brought here? What was going to be the destiny of this nation? Based on how were they going to treat us? Were they going to live up to their creeds of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, that all men are created equal? That's what the struggle was about. And so Abraham Lincoln and the abolitionists and slaves and others fought, and is what brought Lincoln to the point where he was able to sign the Emancipation Proclamation, which which outlawed slavery in slaveholding states. It was a first step, a very important first step. And it was the struggles of all these people who came together and fought in various ways, which enabled Abraham Lincoln to in a very crafty way, push through the 13th Amendment, which was what actually outlawed slavery in this land. And it was their struggles which enabled the passing of the 14th Amendment, which gave us full citizenship and gave us equal protection under the laws, at least in word it did, right? And a right to due process. And it was the struggles of all of those people that enabled the passing of the Voting Rights Act and other legislation which would bring about our freedom, or at least would begin to promote it and open up the doorway, which has a continuing legacy to this day. And so at the passing of the 13th and 14th Amendments and the Voting Rights Act and a wave of legislation, we were at Reconstruction. We had the right to vote. We elected black officials throughout the South. And there was great hope and optimism. It's almost hard to imagine the optimism that was felt. Perhaps we got a sense of that with the election of Barack Obama. A sense of hope, a sense that we had come to another level in our struggle. The Freedmen Bureau was created. Black former slaves were promised 40 acres and a mule, right? We were promised education. We were promised equal rights. And even Europe, around the world, this was recognized. France, in recognition of the freeing of the slaves, gave a gift to the United States called the Statue of Liberty. And parenthetically, perhaps at another time in another speech, we would talk about the fact that the original Statue of Liberty was a black woman whose, in her hands, broken chains hung from her wrists. The Statue of Liberty was a gift in recognition of the abolition of slavery. And that gift would be altered by the time it got here, but the history is there and it's important for us to know. So there was celebration internationally around the freeing of the slaves. But W.E.B. Du Bois would very accurately observe sometime later that, and I quote, "The slave went free, stood for a brief moment in the sun, then again would move back towards slavery." The slave went free, stood for a brief moment in the sun, but then again went back towards slavery. He's talking about Jim Crow. He's talking about the backlash after the freeing of the slaves. He's talking about the wave of segregation and discrimination that would nearly wipe out all of the gains from the emancipation, from the 13th Amendment. And so various policies were put in place that would criminalize the very state of being black. And through a system called the convict lease system, many, particularly black men and boys, were put right back on plantations, working for no money, becoming indebted to the land, indebted to the people who were the former slave masters. Civil rights were wiped away. A wave of lynching took place across the South, and repression and terror and horror once again became our reality. We stood for a brief moment in the sun, but then again moved back towards slavery. But as always, although the dream was deferred, there was continued resistance, there was continued struggle. There were people who never let go of the struggle to be free. And we know them by many different names. many different names, Booker T. Washington, Marcus Garvey, who to this day is still misunderstood, a man who recognized that there was a need for unity of black people internationally, and that we did have a root in Africa, and that we should embrace that. He said, "Up you mighty race, you can accomplish what you will." And the great W.E.B. Du Bois, who had a different perspective, but was focusing on how could we build our legacy and build our families and secure our rights here in this nation. And as a part of the Niagara movement that would later become the NAACP, he and his colleagues formed a major foundation for the work that we're still doing today. And A. Philip Randolph, who stood with the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, who stood for the rights for men to stand up, to work, to feed their families, to have the dignity of any other man, woman, and child in this country. And Thurgood Marshall, who with a group of other brilliant lawyers would litigate all the way to the levels of the Supreme Court and ultimately bring us the decision, the Brown versus Board of Education decision, which outlawed separate but equal. This is the legacy that we're here to celebrate today. And so while the dream was deferred, all these people will continue to struggle, coming up to the civil rights movement of Martin Luther King and the struggles for Voting Rights Act once again, which we had thought we had achieved 100 years earlier, right? The right for equal protection under the law. The struggle continued. But once again, even after the 60s, even after the Voting Rights Act, even after the Civil Rights Act, even after the great achievements to wipe out what was apartheid in this nation, the haunting words of W.E.B. Du Bois continue to resonate. The slaves stood free for a brief moment in the sun, but then moved again back towards slavery. So they killed Malcolm, they killed Martin, they killed Medgar, they killed Bobby, they killed John, they killed thousands of others whose names we don't know, and ruined lives and jailed people. This was the struggle in the 60s. This was the repression, the backlash for the Civil Rights Act and all of the work that we had done over all that time up and through the 60s and the 70s. But meanwhile, the seeds of freedom still would not die, as they never had died. The same seeds, as I said, that were planted by the Africans trying to escape slave catchers back in Africa in the 1500s were planted. And so we still saw people rising up, like Shirley Chisholm. We saw whose work would lead to Jesse Jackson running for president, whose work would lead to the election of Barack Obama. There's a link between these things. The seed was planted and it never died, and the struggle continued. So here we are today, my brothers and sisters. We're at a crossroads. We can cite example after example of success of black folks in the corporate arena, in the athletic arena, in the legal arena, in every facet of life we have achieved. We do have a black president. That is an outstanding, amazing achievement, and we should celebrate that. Absolutely. But while we have this great achievement on one side, we are still faced with racial disparities in every aspect of American life, from medical disparities, health disparities, educational disparities, unemployment, and most of all, what Michelle Alexander has coined the new Jim Crow, the incarceration, the use of incarceration, which has disproportionately impacted the black community to the point where it's hard to find a black man who's able to take care of his family that doesn't have a record hanging over his head or who isn't incarcerated at this time. So we're at a crossroads. What shall we do as we face this crossroads, as we celebrate our successes and as we look at our challenges? Well, I think one thing that we can do, or perhaps the first thing that we can make sure we do, is that we know our history. That we know where we come from, that we know what Juneteenth is, that we know what the Emancipation Proclamation is, and what the struggles were throughout the history from the time that we got on the boats and landed here, and the struggle that's continued. And so we need to read. We need to read books and educate our children and teach them not just that it's important that they be successful, which it is, but that it's important, that it's their duty and their legacy to continue this struggle. And so in closing, I just want to tell you a quick story. In school, we were given an assignment back in high school, I remember, to read a book called Fahrenheit 451. And then we saw the film, Fahrenheit 451, and it was written by Ray Bradbury. And he titled that because the temperature at which, at least at that time, most paper at which it will burn, go up in flames, was at 451 Fahrenheit. So he entitled the book Fahrenheit 451, and it's a story that was set in the future, not too far off distant future if you think about it, where it was illegal to read books. It was illegal to educate yourself in society. And so the firemen, instead of the truck shooting water, they shot fire. Because if they found a book in your house, or if they found a place that had books in it, they would burn it down. And so the story goes that this fireman, one of the firemen, he gets caught stashing books in his own house. And so they burn his house down. And he runs away, but he had heard a legend about this place far out in the woods, where there were these people called book people. And out in the woods, these people had escaped, and they had taken books, and they were reciting the books and teaching the children the books by memory. And then they would burn them so they wouldn't get caught and prosecuted for them. They were called the book people. And I thought about that film, and I thought about that story as I thought about today. Because we need to become the book people. We don't just need to read our history. We don't just need to read the books. We need to be the book. We have to be the book. We have to internalize the history and the lessons. We have to be the Bible. We have to be the Quran. We have to be the Torah. We have to be the Declaration of Independence, not just read it and recite it. We have to be the Constitution. And if we do that, then we can hold our heads high and ensure that the struggles of those who came before us was not in vain, and that we will march forward to victory. Thank you.